Hi, everybody. You're watching the Haider Rifaat Show Season 8 specials. I'm your host, Haider Rifaat, and today I'm joined by Andrew Small, who is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. His research interests are in US-China relations, Europe-China relations, and building foreign and economic policies for China. He is also an author for The Rupture, China and the Global Race for the Future, which released in 2022 last year. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sparing time for this interview.
Thanks a lot. Delighted to join you.
Yes, thank you so much. So first and foremost, before I get to the specifics of things, can you please tell the listeners a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, US think tank. I'm based in Berlin office now. I've been at GMF since 2006. I had been in Beijing before, working at a Chinese think tank and British think tank, and was hired to put together the work at GMF, working on US-European cooperation vis-a-vis China, but also in Asia in general. And most of my work throughout has focused on Chinese foreign and economic policy in a whole series of different regions, and US and European policy towards China. And I've kind of hopped around geographically quite a lot over the years. Quite a lot of my work was on China and South Asia, in particular during the previous stretch of time, and I still follow all of that very closely. But it's really been a quite wide-ranging look at foreign and economic policy on China's part through this whole period of time. And I was 5 years in Brussels, 10 years in DC, and have now been here a couple of years in Berlin.
I see. And Andrew, what specifically drew you towards studying China-US relations particularly?
So I mean, China itself was my focus very much in the first place. I'd taught in China before university. When I started working in foreign policy think tanks in London in the early 2000s, as China was kind of taking off again as a global power. I was extremely interested in getting to Beijing and getting to work even more closely on thinking out really what the trajectory of Chinese power, Chinese foreign policy developments, and Chinese thinking were going to mean for the world. And of course, the US dimension of that is always at the center. I'd interned as well in the US Senate. And then when I was approached by the German Marshall Fund to join and put together their work on US-European policy, this is of course kind of combines almost all the major power centers dealing with these policy questions, and so this is kind of how I came to focus on it in the first place. Actually, the first paper I wrote when I was in Beijing was looking at how to prevent a Cold War between the US and China. That was when I was writing back around 2005 on some of these subjects. So, I mean, I think, of course, structurally, strategically, the US-China dimension of all of these questions, though I do look more widely at China's relations with other powers, of course, this is at the very center of, almost every strategic question facing the world right now. So I was naturally drawn to trying to make sense of what was going on there.
So, Andrew, in recent years, so much has happened between the United States and China, whether it's related to trade or the US highlighting the mistreatment of Uyghur Muslims in China, or the US enforcing boycott on Beijing Olympics, to Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. The causes for these tensions are endless. So, what, in your view, is the future direction of US-China relations moving forward?
So I think you have to look at this on quite a long arc. Although you mentioned quite a list of the important developments that we've seen in recent years, this is less in one way about any of this kind of specific incidents or the to and fro of the kind of tensions and flare-up points in the bilateral relationship as it used to be. I mean, if you go through the kind of quite a long phase of the US-China relationship, you go through and you look at the issues that there were over the South China Sea at other points in the past, over North Korea, over a whole series of other issues. To a certain extent, you had an ebb and flow of tensions and normal diplomacy, and what are you able to reach by way of agreements over Taiwan on this area or this area, economic deals reached, disappointments, things addressed. I mean, there was a sort of rhythm to the relationship of a certain sort. That's gone. I think what you'd had in the arc that goes certainly back to the kind of post 1990s, the 1990s relationship and the relationship with China post WTO accession. I mean, we'd already lost the very close set of military and intelligence ties that you had between China and the United States during the later stages of the Cold War, particularly in the 1980s, and that provided the original rationale for the relationship between the two sides. But when the US was looking to utilize China as a sort of counterbalance to the Soviet Union. But what you had seen through the 90s and 2000s was initially at least some level of confidence that, without the details all being entirely understood, that ultimately China's economic development and its political evolution would go hand in hand, not quickly, but the path of the future that had been laid out by the collapse of the Soviet Union and so many communist regimes around the world, the moves towards democracy in Asia in general that we'd seen in so many countries, that ultimately this would be China's future too, and that it would be possible, therefore, to push ahead with closer and more intertwined economic ties that would benefit certainly Western business, but would also, in the fullness of time, lead to a China that went through a set of political changes of its own. So the fact that you were dealing with an authoritarian state that in the fullness of time as well might otherwise head towards being an outright rival, the hope was that in a sense before that happened, you would have a government in China that would emerge in a different direction. I think what you've seen in the last stretch of time is not only a giving up on the hope that that's possible. I think people understood that some time ago, but also a greater sense on the US side that the technological catch-up of China in a whole series of key areas has accelerated. I think less confidence than you had before that the US could just afford to kind of sit and wait and would be able to maintain a military and technological edge into the indefinite future, that the catch-up had gone faster and further than had been expected, and that what you were actually seeing, you'd already seen a whole series of different economic sectors that China was now operating as a competitor to US industry as well. But this was penetrating the advanced economic sectors as well, that you had essentially a kind of, rather than a complementary economy that was still opening up its market, you had a state-run economy channeling prodigious subsidies towards certain industries that were not only excluding US companies from key sectors of the Chinese market, but that this model was being expanded across the world, that the US was facing these issues in third markets as well. So you had a certain juncture in which you started to see a technological competitor, that translating ever more closely into a peer competitor in military terms, and a trade-off of economic interests that, particularly after that deep comprehensive trade deal that the Trump administration tried to negotiate with the Chinese was impossible to achieve. You were not going to get a balance that continued to be beneficial towards US economic interests either. And what we're seeing emerging, therefore, on multiple different fronts is a view that China is a competitor in economic terms, but is also an ideological competitor, is a military rival, and that the relationship is going to be characterized by far more minimal areas of cooperation than we saw in the past, and that something akin to a system competition is going to be the model that we see emerging in the future. Because I think what we have on the US-China relationship is not, as understood by the US, purely a matter of great power competition. It's something that goes beyond that. It's something that says that the liberal democratic order itself is being challenged by China and by the model that China embodies, and that we will be entering a phase of rivalry that will encompass not just the United States but its partners and allies in among the other free market liberal democracies as well, and that the US is going to be kind of marshalling efforts among a number of these other countries to build the coalitions that can take on some of these issues of common concern vis-a-vis China, and also mutually strengthen each other in the process as well. So I think the model for the relationship, even if we do start to resume some of the kind of more normal diplomacy that we've seen since the G20 in Bali, is going to look much more like what we've seen in the last couple of years than anything that we saw in the preceding phase of the relationship.
Andrew, President Biden met with President Xi Jinping last year in Indonesia to strengthen bilateral ties with each other. So are public talks and appearances like these from both sides effective or of any value at all, in your view?
So, I mean, I think the important thing about that meeting was both sides went into it with a view to say, the relationship is falling too far, too fast. A floor needs to be put under it. The risk factors, particularly when it comes to Taiwan, have escalated, and there needs to be some level of mutual reassurance on some of those fronts. And so I think to a certain extent, it was at least possible to use that meeting to cool things slightly. I think there were real concerns on both sides that some of these dynamics were running a bit outside each other's control. So that element was of value. I think both the US and China want to show other countries that they can manage the relationship responsibly. And I think as much of that meeting was directed not at the two sides' own kind of bilateral relationship, but at everyone else. And you can see in how this has been framed afterwards. China wants to show that it is handling its own relationship with the United States responsibly. The US also needs to show that to its allies, that it's handling the China question judiciously. Because if it's perceived not to be the case, then the willingness to continue cooperating and coordinating and dealing with each other with a whole bunch of other countries on both sides, there will be an impact on that. So these are kind of requests and points of kind of pressure, and we want to see a good relationship, or we want to see at least a well-handled relationship. So I think that was a lot of what that meeting was about. By all accounts, what's gone on since then has not really suggested much substantive change in new avenues on cooperation, even on some of the areas that were being talked about. I think we're still in an incredibly minimal space, as I said, on what the two sides can really do together. But I think what we are getting, after this extended period on the Chinese side in which Xi Jinping was not traveling, in particular, we're starting to get something that looks more like normal bilateral exchanges, not fully yet, but a bit more of a rhythm of a relationship that was barely being conducted at all. I mean, beyond meetings that were being held between the National Security Advisor and his Chinese counterpart, there was very little on any of the channels that were there militarily, on the economic relationship, that was really particularly active. And even if you go back to the Trump administration, you still had a very serious set of summits. You had a very involved set of exchanges on the economic side about the trade deal, and a lot of that's gone. So I think we're starting to get a bit of a resumption of at least some level of more serious contacts between the two sides, without there being any expectation that this is going to translate into what one would call an improved relationship. This is how do you manage a very difficult relationship to mutual benefit and for the sake of everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And what role does Pakistan play in US and China relations, in your view?
I mean, not very many other countries play that much of a role in the US-China relationship in one sense. I mean, there is a core of this that is closely structured through the bilateral side. What I would say is the Biden administration came to office saying that one of the things it was going to do differently in the US-China relationship was a lot more of US-China policy was going to be refracted through allies. It was going to be a kind of ally-centered approach. And so there were all sorts of efforts to coordinate more closely with partners in Asia. Quad was kind of given a sort of enlarged role, partners in Europe, a whole series of new structures put in place there, a revived G7, a whole series of these things that were really about putting a framework in place in which it was not just the United States, it was the US as part of a wider coalition of partners and allies that was handling some of these issues collectively. Pakistan, of course, in this context, is in a difficult spot. In some ways, it is in the highest tier of Chinese partners, by some measures, the most important Chinese partner. But of course, the relationship with the United States, with varying levels of alliedness in the course of that history, it has still been extremely important to Pakistan, and it has been a very difficult spot, I think, for Pakistan in the last few years to handle this kind of intensification of what looks like bloc politics. For Pakistan in the past, this was a set of relations that could coexist very well, partly because from the Chinese perspective, US-Pakistan ties, good US-Pakistan ties, were actually an asset, because when it came to India, if Pakistan was able to get high-quality US economic support, military equipment, and just maintain a good quality set of diplomatic ties, this improved their strategic position on kind of the structural geopolitical issue of greatest concern to China in the region. So it was very happy to see a close US-Pakistan relationship, and if anything was concerned when the US-Pakistan relationship deteriorated, and kind of encouraged both sides in different ways to fix it. Of course, further back in time, Pakistan has its famous historic role in the opening of US-China relations in the first place, with the Kissinger visit being conducted through Pakistan. So I mean, Pakistan, of course, always has this sort of slightly sort of interesting, at least historical kind of role in the bilateral relationship, but of course it's been occluded since. But I think it's been a difficult spot for Pakistan in the last few years, because you've started to get pressures from both sides. The ones that are talked about publicly are the US pressures. You saw the very critical position, at least in the late stages of the Trump administration, on CPEC. And in the earlier stages of the administration, the US had been relatively sympathetic towards what CPEC was about. The view had kind of been, well, this is going to be difficult, but if it helps Pakistan's economic picture, then we're not going to take a position against it, certainly. But we have our concerns about how China does its financing and some of these projects, but we'll keep out of it. Then you got a much more critical position taken, particularly when the Trump administration was kind of embarked on its broader pushback against the Belt and Road, and kind of highlighting a lot of concerns about the Belt and Road in general. I still don't think there was a huge specific concern about CPEC, but in every region of the world, the issues and problems that the US was seeing with Belt and Road projects were given a very prominent role. I think even on CPEC, that has somewhat receded. I don't think the Biden administration is taking the kind of public critical position on CPEC that the Trump administration did for various reasons. But I think Pakistan has nonetheless been at certain junctures in a difficult position where there are real choices to be made, because the bits that aren't made as public on this are that China as well, of course, puts pressure on Pakistan on some of these questions, whether it comes to issues around how is Pakistan handling its relationship with Russia at crucial junctures? How is Pakistan going to sending someone to the Democracy Summit? These sorts of quite practical issues. But I mean, this is a juncture generally in which the pressures of bloc politics are intensifying for all sorts of states, and it's harder for a state like Pakistan that had been able to straddle this and have good relations with both more broadly than countries that very clearly tilted in one direction. and where this is just becomes a reinforcing set of dynamics. I think for Pakistan to kind of try and make sure that it has enough space in the relationship with the US, that it also doesn't allow that it's able to kind of maintain, and certainly preferably from their perspective, improve ties beyond what we'd seen in recent years, and the kind of looking at all of this beyond the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but doing so in a way that is still able to maintain the tight set of intelligence, military, and despite the fact that CPEC has hit a kind of difficult phase, a still significantly expanded set of economic ties with China, and that's going to continue to be important for Pakistan to do.
Mm-hmm. And before concluding the interview, Andrew, I wanted to talk about your new book, The Rupture, China and the Global Race for the Future. So what prompted you to write this book, and what themes do you draw on?
So, I mean, the book was really intended to make a bit of sense of how we've got to where we've got to with China in recent years. There's been this hugely transformative set of shifts particularly in Washington, in DC, but also, as the book looks at as well, a lot of the European capitals, and more widely. I mean, there's been a radical change in the fundamentals of China's relationship with particularly the Western democracies in the last period of time, a complete overturning of lots of the fundamentals of policy towards China. And I, with the book, wanted to really dig in and try and make sense of why this happened, how the actors that were involved in bringing about some of these shifts understood it from their perspective, and to tell the story not just from a US-China prism and from a kind of great power competition framework, but rather looking at these questions of how the systems were interacting. China thinks about these things, as plenty of good Marxists do, in systemic terms. It thinks about power in comprehensive terms, rather than just kind of separate lanes of military, economic, and political power. And what we've seen in recent years in the US approach to China is not just this move into a kind of more rivalrous dynamic. It's been a breakdown of these traditional lanes in which trade questions, security questions, technology questions, industrial policy questions are treated entirely separately. There's a much more integrated mode of thinking on the US side about that, but that's something that is about a wider system. If the US is taking a decision, as one of the areas the book looks at in particular on 5G technology or something like this, that's not just a question about US policy. That's about a whole intertwined set of systems involving European companies, supply chains going across the world. What we've, of course, seen most recently in the restrictions on exports of semiconductors. Again, a decision on semiconductors by the US is not just a US-China decision. That's a decision about Taiwan, about Japan, about Korea, and about some of the specific suppliers in the Netherlands and their sub-suppliers in Germany, and all of these things. These are questions, even just framed in economic terms, that are systemic questions. How do these systems interact with each other? How does the Chinese system interact not just with the US, but the entire open, pretty intertwined system of free market liberal democracies, which have this free flow of technology, components, personnel, funding, financing, and that was a system that had been increasingly intertwined with the Chinese system. And now we're going through a process of trying, at least in a number of areas, to kind of unravel that and find ways to continue to kind of protect, I think, the capacity for economic growth, some kind of core security interests on the US and European side. But that sort of unraveling process is extremely challenging for companies, for governments. And so I wanted to kind of trace how we entered this phase of the relationship, and to a certain extent where it was going, but also for a lot of the sinologists that have worked on this had really hoped for something different. I mean, so many of us have been involved in trying to figure out how do you fix and how do you improve and how do you create a framework in which the different parties can cooperate and can work together on common issues. How we've got to a place where this is either difficult difficult or in some areas impossible now, how a kind of entire generation of China policy hands had got to a position where they're now saying, you know, to a certain extent, although there's a limited amount that one can still do, you have to give up pretty completely on any of the hopes that you'd had in the relationship. So it goes through and it looks at some of the people that have been involved in that process as well, and how some of these conclusions were reached.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for these very valuable insights. I would love to talk more, but I'm short on time. Thank you so much once again. That is all for now, viewers. Stay tuned for more on my official YouTube channel and Facebook page. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.